Welcome everybody, Shiur number 646. We're learning today L'Uflema Liba Bas Golda Bas Sheva and L'Fuah Shlema Gedalia Aaron Ben Sarish. Takav L'Fuah Shlema Psuch Sha'or Chayli Yisrael. Getting back to our malacha of KOSHAIR, tying knots. What about wrapping? Is there an issue of wrapping in reference to a string? Somebody has a string. We know the various different type of knots. We've learned most of the knots in reference to double knots, single knots, and all the various different like. What about if somebody has a string and they want to just wrap it around something and whereby it might stay by tucking it in on the ends? They'll wrap it around 2 or 3 times around something, whatever they want to hold together, and then they'll just tuck these strings in the side of the wrapping of the string. Is that a problem to do on Shabbos, or is it possible to say that might be running into a issue of KOSHAIR tying? Because Lamaisi, you're taking 2 items and you're tying them together sort of. You're wrapping a string around them, and then you're tucking the string into the string itself. You wrap it around 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever the amount of times, and you're tucking the string, and the 2 items are staying together through a tying process. Do we say that wrapping a rope or string around items is the same as tying knots, whereby we saw there were issues with various different type of knots? So it's interesting to note in HILCHOS Lulav, we go now to HILCHOS Lulav actually, in reference to tying the Arba Minim, the Shloisha Minim actually. You have the Adasim, you have the Aravis, and you have the Lulav. You tie them all together. As we know, the minig is in general, most of us put it into what we call a basket type thing, and then we have either 2 rings or 3 rings. And in general, and then we tie it all together, but in general, all this is supposed to be done as much as possible before Yom Tov. So the question comes up, what about on Yom Tov itself, if somebody forgot or they couldn't do it, they didn't have time, whatever the case is, but now they have to do it on Yom Tov itself. So before Yom Tov, you can make knots, you can make whatever you have to make. As far as tying the Aravis and the Adasim together, tying the Lulav together and everything. But now on Yom Tov itself, we know we have problems with certain knots. How do we go about tying the Aravis, the Adasim together with the Lulav if it comes out on Yom Tov? So the Sefer Yitzra Halachos brings down in Simin Tov Reish Nun Aleph, which is the first simin in reference to, that talks about actually somewhat tying the lulav in general, and some of the various different halachas as to pertaining before Yom Tov and on Yom Tov itself. So he brings down B'Shem the Ramah, the Shulchan Aruch, and others that L'maisa v'yeshni hagam legal la'agdam b'Yom Tov koydem hanetila. In other words, if somebody got stuck, they're doing it on Yom Tov or the like. Okay, but when they tie it, he says when one is tying it together on Yom Tov, layase keshe klal, one should be careful not to stop making knots, not to make knots in general, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, how that part of it works. But lamaisa, not to make knots. They're tying the Aravis, the Hadasim, the Lulav all together. They couldn't do it before Yom Tov for whatever reason. And also not to tie it with a bow on top of a knot. As we've learned in the past, the first intertwining, which is the first knot, the intertwining of the laces, string, or whatever it might be, in this case, possibly the leaf, that whereby one ties around the lulav, not to tie, you make the intertwining, and then you make a bow on top of that. That is also a problem because of the fact, as we know, it's going to stay for more than 24 hours. One would like to have their lulav for more than 24 hours. So a bow on top of a knot, we said, should not be done to last for more than 24 hours. But he does bring down ela aniva al gabe aniva, if possible, to do a bow on top of a bow. But then the Sefer Yitzra Halachos, he brings down the Ramah over there. Again, it's in Tov Reish Nun Aleph, Sif Aleph, and the Ramah Taka tells us that, again, in these inyanim, whereby it's done on Yom Tov, that there's one way to do it that would be okay. And he says, Shekarchin Sevivois Shloisha Minim, that to wrap it around the 3 minim, the lulav, the hadasim, and the aravis, shekarchen sevivos shaloisha minim elu, and then so good, I'll wrap it around, it's just going to fall apart. That won't help me. As we know, if you wrap around the string 2-3 times, it's eventually going to just fall apart in a few minutes. V'toichavin roish hakerech toichu igel hakarech. In other words, to tuck it in. We wrap the string around, we wrap the leaf around the three minim, and then we wrap it 2-3 times as much as we need to stay, and then we just tuck in the ends. And the Ramah Taka says, V'chein noihagim, this is the minig, if it's done on Yom Tov. Oh, so the Sefer Lamites, so the Sefer Oitzer Halachas, he brings down the halacha like that, like quoting the Ramah, that the same thing, V'chein is mutar lichroich sevivam ha'ala, one would be around it. One would be allowed to wrap around either a leaf, a leaf like we do from an old lulav, oichut, or some sort of a string, v'yitchayv roish hakarach, and then to tuck in the tips, the ends of the wrapping, toich igul hakarach, inside of the wrapping itself. In other words, you wrap it around 2-3 times, 4 times, and then you just tuck it in without making any knots or anything like that. Wrap it around 2, 3, 4, then tuck it in into the wrapping around of the string, and that would taka be okay. So we see from this taka that wrapping a rope, wrapping a string in general, what we want to get out of it is our halacha. What we're trying to figure out is wrapping a string instead of tying knots and these type of things, taking a string and just wrapping it around, then just tucking it in. I have 2 or 3 items I want to keep together, lulav or no lulav, let's say during the year, during a Shabbos or whatever. I have 2 or 3 items that I want to just tie together somehow. So I would be allowed, taka, to wrap, lifi, this halacha that we're seeing, I would be allowed to wrap around the string a few times and then just tuck in the ends, even though the couple of items that I'm wrapping around with the string will be holding together. So he says that's how he brings it down. Does he say for Oitzer Halachas? He does say one thing just important to keep in mind on Sukkot per se, on Yom Tov. This is talking again to Yom Tov, that v'lo yasa b'Yom Tov hatabois shekarin ringalach, those little the rings that we make for the lulav that we have during the year. Before Sukkot. Most of us usually get it before Sukkot. Either we make it or we buy them. Usually you have young children are making them, and we get them and then we put them onto the lulav. Those rings, those 2 or 3 rings, which depending on one's minig, that they put onto the lulav, sometimes 4, that one has to be careful not to make on Yom Tov. That is taka running into a problem to make those rings on Yom Tov. In other words, they have a leaf of an old lulav or whatever, and they want to make a ring, those little ringalach, as we call it, they put on the lulav. That should not be done on Yom Tov. He brings down for a different reason. He wants to say it could be running into a problem of tikkun mana. But he does say one thing. Lemais, he does bring down that chol elu hanehagim la'agdai b'Yom Tov dafka. There are those who have a minig to do it to put on those rings, but dafka on Yom Tov yachinu hatabois me'erev Yom Tov. They should just make sure to have the rings ready and made from erev Yom Tov, and better not to. And one should not do it on Yom Tov. Now, just putting the rings on once they're made, of course, from before Yom Tov, that is not a problem. Obviously in conjunction with tearing off leaves or so on from either Daravas or Dadasim, which we're not getting into that. Those are halachas of Sukkos. But just putting the rings onto the lulav, that is fine. It's just to make the rings themselves should not be done on Yom Tov itself. Okay, so just to end off the Sefer Shabbos home, Lamaisa says that straight up, that a regular halacha, we quoted the halacha in conjunction with lulav, but in general, the general standard halacha, he brings down that Lamaisa wrapping with the ends tucked in. One wants to wrap strings with a string somehow with the ends tucked in to keep 2 things tied together. He says like this on page 208, does it say for Shabbos home, if a string is merely wrapped tightly around an item or a couple of items, and the ends are tucked in, there is no basis for the prohibition at all of kosher. There's no isser of kosher tying knots in this case on Shabbos, since there's no knot, you're not dealing with a knot. And Itaka brings it down from that Ramah in tofair and aleph, which we just quoted. So again, just real quickly, if a string is merely wrapped tightly around an item, that the ends are tucked in, there's no basis for this isser, and there is no knot, there's no kosher. One may therefore employ this method of wrapping around and then tucking in the ends. One will be allowed to employ this method of wrapping even if one intends to leave the string in place permanently. In other words, they'll wrap it around 3-4 times and then tuck in the string, and I'm leaving it there for a long time, more than 24 hours, more than a week, or whatever the case is. There's no problem, because bichlal, the whole thing does not fall into the isser of kosher tying. Thank you for listening. Atzlach and bracha, kol tov.